September 1st, 1967, 3:00 in the morning. Eichach Women's Prison, Bavaria, West Germany. A 60-year-old woman is alone in her cell. She has been in prison, with one brief and catastrophic interruption, for 22 years. Her husband was shot by the SS in 1945. Her eldest son killed himself in 1964. Her daughter, born at Buchenwald, is estranged. The infant she gave birth to inside Landsberg prison in 1947 was taken from her arms and handed to a German child welfare agency and raised in an orphanage. He found her last year. He had been visiting monthly. He is the only person in the world who comes to see her. She has spent the last hour writing him a note. It is not long. It says, "There is no other way. Death for me is a release." Then she tears her bedsheet into a length of cloth. She fashions it into a noose. She ties it to a heating pipe inside her cell. She hangs herself. Prison guards find her in the morning, 3 weeks before her 61st birthday. Her name is Ilse Koch. The world called her the Witch of Buchenwald. The Bitch of Buchenwald. The Beast. Newsweek, reporting her death the following week, described it as the dismal end of the best hated woman in the world. And here is what makes the story of Ilse Koch so persistently, maddeningly complicated. The crime that made her the best hated woman in the world, the lampshades made from human skin, the gloves from tattooed prisoners. The woman who selected men for death because she wanted their skin for decorative objects, that crime, in the legal sense, was never proven. Not in 1947. Not in 1951. The lampshade that American soldiers displayed at Buchenwald in April 1945, the one that had been photographed and shown to German civilians, marched through the camp and broadcast worldwide, disappeared before it could be forensically tested. The photo album allegedly bound in human skin was gone. The gloves were gone. The physical evidence the prosecution needed evaporated, and two separate courts, one American and one West German, could not establish a direct proven connection between Ilse Koch and the objects that had made her name synonymous with the worst of human depravity. But here is also what the courts did establish. That Ilse Koch had lived inside a concentration camp for 4 years, where tattooed human skin had been harvested, tanned and fashioned into objects by the camp's pathology department under orders from SS physicians. That human skin objects were confirmed to have existed at Buchenwald. That prisoners with distinctive tattoos had disappeared after being noticed by camp personnel. That Ilse Koch had beaten prisoners with a riding crop. That she had ordered prisoners who looked at her while she rode through the camp to be punished. That she had prisoners who served her while she was naked beaten for the offense of seeing her. That she had participated in and benefited from the vast embezzlement operation her husband ran, extracting hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks worth of goods and construction work from prisoners, building luxury facilities for her personal use, and that she had done all of this voluntarily, enthusiastically, and with what multiple witnesses and the SS's own investigative judges described as genuine enjoyment. She did not have the power of a commandant. She had no official SS rank. She was, on paper, a wife. And she was, in practice, someone who had found in Buchenwald a stage for a cruelty that might, in a different set of circumstances, have found no outlet at all. This is the story of how a secretary from Dresden became the most reviled woman in post-war history, what she actually did, and what she was accused of doing. What the courts found and couldn't find, what happened when an American general reduced her sentence, and the world nearly came apart with fury. And what it means that the best hated woman in the world spent her final night alone in a cell, writing a note to a son she had only known for a year. September 22nd, 1906, Dresden, Germany. Marguerite Ilse Claire was born to Max and Anna Claire, a Protestant lower-middle-class family in one of Germany's most beautiful cities. Her father was a factory foreman. There was nothing in her childhood that marked her as unusual. Her teachers described her as polite and content. She completed trade school, learned secretarial and bookkeeping skills, and found work as a secretary. Germany in the 1920s was economically devastated, politically fragile, and socially radicalized by the trauma of the First World War and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Inflation had wiped out savings. Unemployment was catastrophic. The political extremes were both growing. By chance, some of Ilse's secretarial work in the early 1930s brought her into contact with Nazi Party organizations. In April 1932, she joined the Gestapo. She was 25 years old. In 1934, through social engagement with the local SS detachment in Dresden, she met Karl Otto Koch. He was 10 years her senior, an SS officer with an already distinguished record within the concentration camp system, having served as commandant at several facilities. He was rising within the organization. He was, by the personnel assessments his superiors wrote about him, hard, vigorous, goal-oriented, ideologically committed, and strict but just. He was the kind of man the SS wanted. Ilse was attracted to him immediately. She described herself as captivated by men in uniform. They became lovers. In 1936, she followed him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he had been posted as commandant. They married in May 1937 after obtaining the required SS racial purity clearance from the Office of Racial and Settlement Affairs, which investigated both parties' Aryan ancestry and certified them fit to reproduce within the racial state. It was a bureaucratic love story. 3 months after the wedding, in August 1937, Karl Otto Koch was assigned to build and then command a new concentration camp on a forested hill near the historic German town of Weimar, Goethe's town, Schiller's town, the cradle of German literary culture. Karl suggested to Heinrich Himmler that the camp be named after the beech forest surrounding it. They called it Buchenwald, beech forest. Ilse followed her husband and moved into the 3-story commandant's villa on the campgrounds with him. It was surrounded by trees. It had a garden. It had a greenhouse. A riding arena worth $250,000 Reichsmarks was constructed for her by prisoner labor. It had a swimming pool. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful home. On one side of its walls was a garden. On the other side was a concentration camp. Buchenwald opened in 1937 with 2,561 prisoners. By 1938, after Kristallnacht and the massive wave of Jewish arrests that followed, it held nearly 11,000. By 1945, approximately 280,000 people had passed through it. At least 56,000 of them died there. Prisoners were worked to death, starved, experimented on, shot, hanged, beaten, and killed by disease and neglect. The camp had a crematorium. It had a pathology department. It had a gallows. It had an underground execution chamber in the basement of the building adjacent to the crematorium, where prisoners were brought in under the pretense of having their height measured, and then shot through a mechanism concealed in the measuring board while they stood against it. Into this world, Ilse Koch moved in 1937 as a commandant's wife, with no official role and considerable unofficial presence. She rode through the camp on horseback. She wore clothes that survivors later described as deliberately provocative, short skirts, see-through blouses. She carried a riding crop. If a male prisoner working in the campgrounds looked at her, he was beaten. If he was caught looking at her on multiple occasions, survivor testimony suggested, he might be selected for harsher punishment. She ordered prisoners serving her in the villa to attend to her while she was not dressed, and then had them beaten for the offense of having seen her. She constructed a world in which she was simultaneously the object of male attention, and the one who punished men for providing it. The riding crop was the instrument through which she resolved this contradiction. The SS judge who investigated the Kochs in 1943, a man named Konrad Morgan, wrote in his report that Frau Koch had a character in no way inferior to her husband's in terms of greed, pride, and cruelty. He called her a nymphomaniac. He reported that she had conducted simultaneous affairs with the camp's chief medical officer, Dr. Waldemar Hoven, and with the deputy commandant. The villa on the hill hosted what multiple accounts described as orgies attended by SS staff. The Kochs drank heavily. They ate well. They accumulated an indoor sports arena for her. Stolen goods from prisoner transports filling the rooms. The embezzlement operation Karl ran, which was eventually estimated at least 700,000 Reichsmarks, meant that the camp's resources were being siphoned continuously into their personal enrichment, gold extracted from prisoner teeth, property confiscated during arrivals, goods sold from camp stores. The Kochs treated Buchenwald as a private income stream, and Ilse was part of that operation and benefited from it directly. And then there were the tattoos. The pathology department at Buchenwald, under the supervision of SS camp physician Dr. Hans Miller, had by 1941 begun what the camp's own records described as a practice of removing, tanning, and preserving tattooed skin from the corpses of dead prisoners. The skins, according to accounts from prisoners who worked in the pathology department, were fashioned into everyday objects: pocket knife cases, lampshades, gloves, book covers. Some were sent to Berlin as gifts. Some remained in the camp. Witnesses later testified that they had personally worked on these objects. A Nuremberg trial witness named Bachalowski stated that he had seen SS personnel leaving Block 2, the pathology block, with human skin in their arms, and that comrades who worked in the block told him the SS had received orders for human skin, and that tanned skins were given to guards and visitors. He added, when the Americans liberated the camp, they still found tattooed and tanned skin. The connection between this practice and Ilse Koch was made by multiple witnesses. A Franciscan monk who had been imprisoned at Buchenwald testified at the 1947 trial that he had seen Ilse Koch note the number of a prisoner with a distinctive sailing ship tattoo. The prisoner was summoned by camp guards that same evening and disappeared. 6 months later, the monk said he saw a piece of preserved skin with that tattoo in the camp pathology department. Later still, he said he saw the same tattoo on the cover of Ilse Koch's personal photo album. The testimony was devastating in its specificity. It was also undermined. Under cross-examination, the monk could not keep his story consistent. He first said the tattoo had appeared on Koch's photo album, then on a lampshade, then back on the album. 2 American war correspondents who had been shown the photo album stated that in their view it was not made of human skin at all, and that no tattoo was visible on it. The central lampshade, the one that had been displayed to German civilians in April 1945, to delegations of Allied politicians, to international press photographers, had disappeared. No one could account for it. It had been on the table of specimens laid out in front of the pathology barracks on April 16, 1945, photographed by U.S. Army Signal Corps photographer Walter Chichersky. German civilians from Weimar, 1,000 of them ordered by the American city commander to tour the camp and confront what had been done 4 miles from their homes, had filed past that table. They had seen the lampshade, the shrunken heads, the jars of organs, the pieces of tattooed human skin. They had seen it. And then the lampshade had been mishandled, passed around, taken as a souvenir perhaps, moved without proper chain of custody, and by the time the prosecution needed it in court, it was gone. The American prosecutor at the Dachau trial, a lawyer named William Denson, who had graduated from West Point and Harvard Law, and who had been pursuing concentration camp war criminals since 1945, with what observers described as personal moral commitment, called Ilse Koch no woman in the usual sense, but a creature from some other tortured world. He meant it as an indictment. The description functioned instead as an excuse. Because the legal problem with Ilse Koch was precisely that she was a woman in a system that had been designed and run almost entirely by men. She held no official rank. She had no command authority. The soldiers, the guards, the SS physicians, the commandant himself, all of these were men. When something happened at Buchenwald because someone in authority ordered it, that authority was technically male. Ilse Koch was the commandant's wife. She was present. She was, by every survivor account, enthusiastically participatory. But the legal architecture of the trial kept running into the problem of connecting her specific actions to specific deaths through a chain of documented command that could withstand a legal challenge. She was charged not with directly killing anyone, but with participating in a common criminal design, the operation of Buchenwald as a place of deliberate murder and brutality. On August 14, 1947, she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was the only woman among 31 people indicted. While in custody at Dachau prison awaiting trial and serving the early months of her sentence, she had become pregnant. The circumstances were, and remained, murky. Rumors among prison staff named an American soldier. Other accounts suggested a German prisoner worker. She refused throughout her life to identify the father. She was 8 months pregnant when her sentence was handed down. On October 29, 1947, at Landsberg prison, she gave birth to a son. She named him Lieurey. He was taken from her arms and given to Bavarian child welfare authorities. He was raised in an orphanage and a foster home. He did not know who his mother was until he was a teenager, when he saw her name on his birth certificate. He did not make the connection until he was 19. In June 1948, General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, reviewed a clemency petition submitted on Koch's behalf. Clay was a man who had, in the same period, ordered and overseen the execution of over 100 Nazi war criminals at Landsberg prison, men he had determined were guilty and beyond clemency. He was not a soft man. But he was a legal man, and the review board's assessment of the Ilse Koch trial had found something he could not ignore. The report concluded that the power of propaganda and mass suggestion has never been better illustrated than in the case against Ilse Koch. Long before the trial, it said, she had already been found guilty in the public mind as the Witch of Buchenwald. Stories about her went from mouth to mouth and were embellished with ever more colorful details. But when it came to evidence in court, the bottom line was that the record lacked evidence for these stories. On June 8, 1948, Clay commuted her life sentence to 4 years, including time already served. She would soon be free. The reaction was one of the most intense expressions of public outrage in the post-war years. The New York News ran the headline, "Perhaps our military revised the verdict only so Ilse Koch can get back into the lampshade business." The New York Mirror compared her light sentence to soldiers serving 20 years in American prisons for hitting an officer once. Protesters at a German trade fair in New York carried signs reading how expensive are Ilse Koch's lampshades. Newspapers across America and Europe ran her story again, reliving the most lurid details of the trial testimony. Veterans organizations were furious. Jewish organizations were furious. The public was furious. On October 17, 1949, Koch was released from American custody. She stepped out of prison a free woman. She had been free for exactly as long as it took the West German authorities to arrest her again. They were waiting for her on release day. The West German government charged her with crimes against German nationals, a jurisdictional approach that got around the limitations of the American military tribunal. She was taken back into custody immediately. The international outrage that had been building since Clay's commutation had, in effect, forced Germany to act. On December 27, 1948, a United States Senate committee had issued its assessment of Koch's case. It found that her guilt in specific murders was indisputably established. It called her a bestial woman. The political pressure on both the American government and the West German government was enormous. A new trial was opened. It began on November 27, 1950, before the Augsburg District Court. It lasted 7 weeks. 250 witnesses testified, including 50 who testified in Koch's defense. The trial was an international media event. Koch herself performed in it. She collapsed and had to be carried from the courtroom in late December 1950 during particularly damaging testimony. She collapsed again on January 11, 1951, according to one newspaper account. When a verdict seemed to be going against her at one point during the proceedings, she screamed, "I am guilty. I am guilty," from the dock. Her behavior, carefully calibrated for maximum sympathy, impressed no one. The psychiatrists appointed to examine her during the proceedings produced a clinical assessment that entered the historical record as one of its more striking documents. They described her as a perverted, nymphomaniacal, hysterical, power-mad demon. These were clinical practitioners issuing a formal psychiatric assessment. The language reflected both the genuineness of their evaluation and the limitations of the clinical vocabulary available for describing a person who had lived for 4 years as the queen of a concentration camp and found it suited her. On January 15, 1951, the Augsburg court convicted Ilse Koch a second time. The lampshade charges were dropped again. The prosecution could not prove the skin objects had been made or that Koch had specifically ordered the killing of tattooed prisoners. But the court found her guilty of incitement to murder, of having directed abuse that had caused deaths, of having participated knowingly and actively in the criminal enterprise of Buchenwald. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, the second life sentence of her legal career. The court's written judgment labeled her crimes particularly egregious because she had consciously suppressed any feeling of compassion and pity she had as a woman, and instead given free rein to her pursuit of power and prestige, her arrogance and her selfishness. The court noted her stubborn and irresponsible denial and her total incapacity for the slightest admission of guilt. She appealed. The Federal Court of Justice dismissed the appeal on April 22, 1952. She petitioned the International Human Rights Commission. They rejected her. The Bavarian Ministry of Justice received several clemency petitions. It rejected all of them. She was going to die in prison. She had already lost most of what could be lost. Her husband Karl had been shot by an SS firing squad on April 5, 1945, 1 week before the Americans liberated Buchenwald. He had been executed not for the murders he had ordered and the system of mass death he had operated, but for the embezzlement, the unauthorized killings of 3 prisoners, the corruption. He was executed by the very organization he had served with total commitment for crimes that were, by comparison with his broader activities, almost administrative offenses. He died raving like a madman, according to contemporaneous accounts, during his final night. Her infant daughter, Gudrun, had died of pneumonia at 4 months old in February 1941, while the family was still living in the villa at Buchenwald. Her son Artwin, born at Buchenwald in 1938, grew up under the weight of knowing who his parents were. He died by suicide in 1964, unable, according to accounts that reached his sister Gisela, to reconcile himself with the shame of his parents' crimes. He was 26 years old. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Ilse Koch remained at Eichach Women's Prison, filing petitions, writing letters, maintaining to prison staff and to anyone who would listen that she was innocent, that she had been a good mother who had known nothing of what occurred at the camp, that she had been victimized by media hysteria and the political convenience of having a female face to attach to the worst of what Buchenwald represented. Prison staff reports from those years, cited in the 2023 Harvard University Press study of her case, describe a woman who had developed delusional thinking in her later years. She had become convinced that concentration camp survivors were going to come to her cell and abuse her. She heard threats that were not there. She believed she was being monitored and targeted in ways that extended beyond the obvious monitoring of a prison environment. Then, at Christmas 1966, a young man arrived at Eichach prison with what he described as a creepy feeling. He was 19 years old. His name was Uwe Clare. He had been 8 years old when he first saw the name on his birth certificate, and he had spent the next 11 years wondering. And then at 19 he had read a newspaper article about his mother and understood. He went to Eichach and met her. He later described the reunion as joyous. They began meeting monthly as prison rules allowed. For the first time since Artwin had died in 1964, Ilse Koch had someone who came to see her, who was not a lawyer or a court-appointed examiner. She had her son. For 9 months they visited. And then, during the night of September 1st, 1967, Ilse Koch sat in her cell at Eichach prison and wrote Uwe a note. "There is no other way. Death for me is a release." She made a noose from her bedsheet. She attached it to the heating pipe. She was 60 years old. She had been in prison for most of the previous 22 years. She had been tried twice, convicted twice, sentenced to life twice, had lost appeals at every level of the German legal system, had been rejected by the International Human Rights Commission, had watched her husband die, watched her son die, given birth in a prison, and had the baby taken immediately. The son she had finally met had been coming for 9 months. She had her note written to him. She hanged herself in the cell. Guards found her in the morning. She was 60 years old, 3 weeks before her 61st birthday. The objects. Let's return to the objects, because they remain unresolved, and the historical record requires you to hold that. What is documented beyond legal dispute is that Buchenwald's pathology department processed human skin. American soldiers who entered the camp on April 11, 1945, found the pathology block and what was in it. An American pathologist examined 3 pieces of tattooed human skin shortly after liberation and confirmed they were of human origin. 2 shrunken heads of Soviet prisoners of war were found in the same block. A desk lamp was found in the camp commandant's study, and it was included on the table of specimens displayed to the Weimar civilians on April 16th. A British parliamentary delegation visited Buchenwald on April 21, 1945, and a member of the delegation received from the camp's prisoner chaplain a penknife case made from human skin and a small piece of tattooed skin. The parliamentarian brought these back to Britain and submitted them to the forensic pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, for examination. After visual and microscopic study, Spilsbury concluded that both artifacts resembled human skin. The Buchenwald Memorial holds these objects today. The small lampshade recovered by a German political prisoner named Karl Straub immediately after liberation is in the memorial's collection, donated in 1953. Forensic examination of it in 1992 was inconclusive, suggesting possible synthetic material. A 2023 analysis using advanced microscopic and genetic methods has again been inconclusive. The uncertainty of the material does not alter the certainty of the practice. The practice was documented. The skin objects existed. The question the courts could never conclusively answer was whether Ilse Koch specifically directed their creation, whether she specifically selected the men whose skin became those objects, whether the tattoo she noticed on a prisoner in the yard on a particular afternoon in 1941 was deliberately translated into an order that ended with that man's death, and his skin processed in the pathology block. The answer, which 2 courts examined extensively and could not establish beyond the legal standard of proof, may have been yes. The witnesses who described the process were credible in their description of the process. Their inconsistencies concerned the details that would have connected Koch specifically to specific objects. Those details, when pressed, didn't hold. And the central piece of physical evidence, the lampshade displayed to thousands of people at Buchenwald in April 1945, and photographed and broadcast worldwide and described in news reports across the globe, could not be found when the prosecution needed it. What the courts could establish, and did establish, was that Ilse Koch had been present at Buchenwald as more than a passive bystander. She had beaten prisoners. She had ordered prisoners beaten. She had participated in a regime of deliberate cruelty directed at the people her husband's camp was crushing. She had lived inside the criminal enterprise of Buchenwald and not merely tolerated it but inhabited it, used it, found in it the vehicle, for satisfactions that had no other outlet available to her. A woman with no official power who had discovered that the proximity to official power, the position of wife of the commandant, gave her a different kind of power, arbitrary, unaccountable, personal, and that she had used that power the way the accounts all describe. With a riding crop, with an eye for the men who looked at her, with an appetite for the luxury that prisoner labor built for her, and the wealth her husband's embezzlement funded. General Clay, years later, reflecting on the decision that had produced more public outrage than anything else he did in Germany, said, "There was absolutely no evidence in the trial transcript, other than she was a rather loathsome creature, that would support the death sentence." He did not say she was innocent. He said she was loathsome. He said the evidence for the specific charge, that she had selected prisoners with interesting tattoos and had them killed for their skin, was not there in the trial record. He was right about the evidence. He was right that the specific charge could not be proven, and the world hated him for it, because the world needed Ilse Koch to be guilty of the lampshades, not merely guilty of being a loathsome creature who had beaten prisoners and lorded over a concentration camp and extracted personal luxury from the suffering of the people imprisoned there. The lampshades were the thing the public could hold. The lampshades were the thing that transformed Buchenwald's horror into an image that fitted neatly into the narrative of absolute, incomprehensible evil. If you made lampshades from human skin, you were beyond the category of human. You were the witch of Buchenwald. You were no woman in the usual sense, but a creature from some other tortured world. You were something that had departed from the human, and therefore something whose crimes did not require the rest of humanity to examine itself too closely. If Ilse Koch was a monster, an inhuman creature, then what she had done required only a monster, not a system, not an ideology absorbed by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Germans, not the routine functioning of bureaucratic dehumanization, just a monster. And the lampshades were the proof of the monster. But the lampshades could not be proven. And Ilse Koch remained something more troubling than a monster. She remained a secretary from Dresden who had joined the Nazi Party at 25, fallen in love with a man in uniform at 28, moved into a villa at a concentration camp at 31, and spent 4 years there discovering what she was capable of when she had the power to be anything at all. She had beaten men with a riding crop. She had punished men for looking at her. She had lived inside the daily murder of Buchenwald, and found it, by every account, comfortable, the riding arena built for her. The food while the prisoners starved. The orgies at the villa while the crematorium processed bodies 4 miles from where Goethe had written Faust. She had been, in the SS judge's own assessment made in 1943, a character in no way inferior to her husband's in terms of greed, pride and cruelty. The SS itself had reached that conclusion while investigating her for corruption. Yu went to the prison the morning of September 2, 1967 for what was supposed to be a monthly visit. He was told his mother had hanged herself during the night. He was 20 years old. He had known her for 9 months. In 1971, he went to the press and began a campaign for her posthumous rehabilitation, arguing that the most serious charges against her had never been proven and that she had been unfairly targeted. He was not wrong about the charges. He was a young man who had met his mother for the first time at 19 and had visited her monthly for 9 months, and who then lost her to a bedsheet noose in a cell at Eichach. He wanted her to be innocent. He argued the case the evidence allowed him to argue. She was his mother, her son Artwin, who had grown up with her, who had been born at Buchenwald and raised in the commandant's villa surrounded by what the camp contained, had not been able to make the same argument. He died at 26. He had known who she was all his life. The knowing had destroyed him. Ilse Koch's body was buried without ceremony. There is no public grave. There is no marker. In 1954, when the East German Memorial at Buchenwald was opened in the former inmates' canteen, the collection on display included the pieces of tattooed human skin from the pathology department, the lampshade, the shrunken heads, the jars of preserved organs. These things were real. The practice at Buchenwald was real. The skin objects were real. The connection between those objects and the woman who rode through the camp with a riding crop and noted the numbers of men with interesting tattoos was argued in 2 courts and could not be legally established. The objects are still at the Buchenwald Memorial. The woman who may or may not have ordered them made is buried somewhere in Bavaria, in an unmarked grave. Her last note said death is a release. She had been saying she was innocent since the day she was arrested. She had never, in 22 years of custody and trial and appeal and petition, expressed a word of acknowledgement for what had happened at Buchenwald. Not to the prisoners she had beaten. Not to the people who had been processed through the camp while she rode her horse and built her sports arena. Not to the dead. The note she left was addressed to her son. It was not addressed to any of them. She was guilty. 2 courts said so. What they could not say was exactly what she was guilty of. And the difference between what they could prove and what the world needed her to have done is the space where the story of Ilse Koch has lived for 80 years. Not in the lampshades, which may or may not have been hers. In the riding crop, which was,